Right, so I'm going to kick off and looking at, as I say, what I call breaking the cycle. Well, what do I mean by breaking the cycle? And let's look at it from a lawyer's perspective. Obviously, we usually get involved when things have begun to go wrong. And typically, it's in the context of where the employer is managing attendance or absence issue, a capability process, or sometimes a conduct issue. And there's some aspect of mental health that is at play or is affecting that situation. What we see are some pretty complex issues that arise. Partly, there might be medical issues. With mental health, sometimes it is far more difficult to diagnose what the issue is. And certainly at times, the prognosis in relation to poor mental health is much more uncertain than it is with physical ill health. Not always the case, but very often that's the case. Often there can be a difficult either personal or workspace background to the issue. Sometimes both might be at play, affecting somebody's mental health. One enormously common feature is that an adversarial mindset arises. So you get polarization. So often the employer will be saying, well, hang on, the employee isn't doing things properly, they're not meeting our standards, our expectations, etc. And the employer is saying, I'm being persecuted by my employer, they're treating me unfairly. And you just get this downward spiral in the employment relationship. Particularly where somebody goes off sick, so they're not within the workplace, and it just results in long disputes and lengthy absences, and so that's a common picture. What are some of the causes of that downward spiral in the employment relationship? Often it's on the employee side, the employee can be feeling isolated. Frequently, there's a fear of the employer or colleague reaction to issues of mental ill health. So if they say something about their mental health, how will their colleagues react to it? What will their perceptions be? How will their employer react to it? Frequently, there's a feeling of injustice and unfairness on the part of the employee. They feel that as I say, they're effectively being persecuted, unfairly treated by the employer. And the employer is saying, well, all we're doing is just applying our normal expectations. That sometimes is compounded by employer ignorance in relation to mental health. There remain significant levels of prejudice, and there more commonly remain assumptions that are made by employers about ill health issues, which we have to acknowledge are gradually improving as a result of the far greater dialogue about mental ill health, but they still exist. Often employers are confused about how to address the issue, and often they communicate poorly in the context of mental ill health. They're worried about talking about it because they don't know how to approach the issue. When you look at those things, one of the thoughts that occurs to me is that a lot of those issues which contribute to the very negative position in relation to an individual dispute or problem with a particular employee are things which can be dealt with at an organizational level. So there are things that you can do as an organization about how you approach the issue of mental health, about individuals' ability and willingness to talk about it and address problems that help to remove some of those causes of that downward spiral. And that's the area that Rebecca is going to be talking about later on. I'm going to move on now to the question of disability, because how any particular employee relations issue where there's a mental health component is dealt with may well depend on whether or not the individual is technically disabled within the meaning of the Equality Act. So it's worth just looking at that definition and how it's been applied by the courts in one or two quite interesting cases. So we all know the definition of disability. It's somebody suffers from a physical or mental impairment which has a long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out day-to-day activities. And that's kind of supplemented by the EHRC code, which acknowledges that mental impairment can cover a wide range of impairments relating to mental functioning. And it also refers to learning disabilities. So let's look at a couple of cases where the tribunal and subsequently the Employment Appeal Tribunal have had to consider mental health in the context of disability. And the most important and helpful observation that was made was in the case of Jay against DLA Piper, the law firm. Doesn't really matter, but and that was that the focus should be on the impact that the condition has on the individual's ability to carry out day-to-day activities. So rather than trying to diagnose the particular impairment and work out whether it might be stress, anxiety, or depression, or any other mental health condition, the focus must be on the impact of the condition. Because what they then say is that if you draw the conclusion that the condition does have a substantial impact on somebody's ability to carry out day-to-day activities, then it will follow, they say, as a matter of common sense inference, that the claimant is suffering from an impairment and is therefore disabled. So it's clearly saying that in order to work out whether somebody suffers from a disability, spend less time looking at the condition and more time looking at the impact of the condition, because that will help you arrive at an answer. On a slightly different note, the EAT in that case drew a distinction between symptoms of low mood and anxiety caused by clinical depression and those that derive from a medicalisation of work problems or adverse life events. Whilst the former was likely to be a disability, the latter was not. So what they're saying there is that there are some effects which are a medical reaction to things that are going on in life, work problems or life events, which may well not be a disability. And that was expanded on in the next case that I'm going to look at. And this is one which it probably should be regarded as helpful to employers in arguing that an individual doesn't suffer from a disability. So they expanded on the distinction drawn in the DLA Piper case. And they made a number of observations. First of all, they said there is a class of case where the individual will not give way or compromise over an issue at work and refuses to return to work, yet in other respects suffers no or little apparent adverse effect on normal day-to-day activities. A doctor may be more likely to refer to the presentation of such an entrenched position as stress rather than anxiety or depression. Unhappiness with a decision or a colleague, a tendency to nurse grievances or a refusal to compromise are not of themselves mental impairments. They may simply reflect a person's character or personality. So what that's saying is that where you've got somebody in that situation who is finding it difficult to compromise, who is nursing a grievance, etc., then it's unlikely to be a disability. It's more their character or personality. Well, I think that's helpful because it pushes against the notion that somebody in that situation is suffering from a disability, but may still be difficult to apply. And then they made the final observation that once you get to the tribunal stage, any medical evidence that supports a diagnosis of mental impairment must be considered with great care. Similarly, any evidence of adverse effect over and above an unwillingness to work or return to work until an issue is resolved. Again, saying that, well, hang on, you've got to be skeptical if there is medical evidence which says that they're suffering from a disability. It may well be simply a reluctance to compromise, nursing agreements, etc. And then, as always, they conclude, at the end of the day, any particular case has to be determined by the tribunal. So I'm going to hand over now to Rebecca, who's going to look at some of the different areas about how to deal with mental health situations within the workplace.
Thank you very much, Simon. And I think the first thing that we need to look at is really why should employers be so concerned about mental health in the workplace? It seems as though there has been so much attention on mental health in the workplace in the last 5, 6, 7 years or so, that you would think that people have probably now just about got it right. Well, that's obviously not the correct approach, because we're looking at mental health, mental ill health, and it's something that has to be treated in a very similar way to physical ill health. And we don't expect that we've got that right. We see from various surveys that mental ill health is still the top cause of long-term sickness absence. And those of you that look at the CIPD wellbeing survey when it comes out annually will note that there are still fundamental issues in terms of working days that are lost due to mental health. So just under 18 million for 2019, 2020. And obviously it's going to be interesting when the stats come out in the next CIPD report, what the impact of COVID has been on working days lost due to mental health. And my colleague Stephen Tenhove is going to talk about some of the issues in respect of long COVID following my session. But I think one of the most staggering statistics and really worrying statistics still is that 38% of employees believe that if they reveal a mental health problem, it will jeopardize their career. So Simon was talking about stigma, and we may think, well, how on earth can we have that stigma in the workplace still? And I think perhaps at a general level, in terms of talking about mental health, that stigma is no longer there. But at an individual level, people are still very worried that their jobs, their careers, the type of work, the quality of work that they may do is going to be impacted if they reveal that they have a health condition that is a mental health condition. So that, I think, should be at the forefront of employers' sort of strategies in terms of making sure that people are aware that actually a mental health problem does not have to jeopardize somebody's career. And that leads on to the other stat on this slide, that whilst we have come a long way in the last decade in respect of dealing with mental health and well-being in the workplace, 50% of employers still don't have a formal well-being strategy that they can communicate to employees. So 5 years on from the Stevenson Farmer report, which was commissioned by Theresa May in her government, are things as bleak, perhaps, as they were? Well, I don't think that they are quite so bleak, because, as I said before, we have a much greater willingness to talk about mental health. There is a general appreciation that somebody may have chronic mental health problems, but they can still perform incredibly well, and particularly if they have the right support from the employers to do so. And that's fundamental, making sure that right support is in place. However, it can't be in place if somebody isn't prepared to talk about their mental health problems, and can't be in place if the employer doesn't have strategies in place as to how they can help. But I think one of the most important things that came out of the Stevenson Farmer report was the acknowledgement that when we're talking about mental health, it is the case that we all have mental health, and all of our mental health will fluctuate from good mental health, where we're thriving, to times when actually we may be struggling, and struggling may then manifest itself in performance issues. So starting from the position that we all have mental health does, I think, allow people to be much more willing to talk about mental health and their mental health as well. We have so many initiatives now that workplaces are keen to promote. We've got Mental Health Awareness Week coming up in May. And interestingly, that's talking about the subject of loneliness, which probably for many, they wouldn't necessarily think loneliness is something that goes hand in hand with mental health. But when you think about it, it's probably pretty obvious. And we've heard lots of the pandemic stories about people really having, sort of an issue about being home, working remotely during the pandemic, and really wanting to get back to the office because it's been affecting what was previously good mental health. What we also have, I think, now is a top-down approach that many employers will champion. So from the leadership perspective, leaders who are prepared to put mental health at the top of the agenda are prepared to invest in well-being initiatives and strategies, and prepared to have a culture within their workplace that is a culture which is positive towards both promoting good mental health, but also supporting employees when their good mental health declines. So having wellness and well-being programs in place is really important. But probably one of the most important things that an organisation can do is to actually identify mental health problems at an early stage so that they can intervene and put in place and communicate the support that is available for employees. So all of those issues in terms of what has happened since the Farmer-Stevenson report and all of the awareness that is out there has actually created a huge expectation now that employees have of employers in how they do deal with mental health in the workplace. So employees are expecting that their employers will support them and that they will develop and continue to develop and act on initiatives that they have put in place. So they may have seen mental health week initiatives, they may have seen time to change, but what they're wanting is a continuing approach and a continuing culture, that there is a safe and supportive workplace, an environment for them to perform their role in. So promoting wellbeing strategies rather than just having them written down is really important. Calling out negative behaviours that might occur in respect of mental health problems. So negative behaviours might be managers who aren't prepared to tolerate anything less than 100% performance, irrespective of the fact that somebody's previously good mental health may be in a period where it has declined. Being able to spot, managers being able to spot when people need extra support is really important, and probably even more difficult, unfortunately, now that we have people working more remotely. So managers need to be given some signposts as to what to look out for in terms of people's declining mental health. That everybody understands the importance of well-being, not only to create that safe and supportive culture, but to actually understand the business importance of well-being in terms of on the bottom line financially, and on issues such as recruiting new staff, and also retaining existing staff who feel that they are being treated properly. And employees expect that their mental health should be looked after in the workplace, in that there shouldn't be unhealthy stress created. So managers are not putting demands on them which are extremely difficult to achieve. So demands in terms of deadlines that are unreasonable, demands in terms of seeking to provide them with work that they haven't been trained to do, or managers not dealing with issues in the workplace that are causing stress, such as bullying and difficult workplace relationships, for example. And what is also expected, and sort of moving into slightly more legal territory, is there is an implied term that if you're going to be talking about somebody's individual mental health, that should be dealt with on a confidential basis. That's all part of the implied duty of trust and confidence. People don't want to open up and discuss their mental health and then find that it's actually something that's either being shared with other employees or it's potentially being used against them to their detriment. Employers also have, I think, quite a hard task in that employees will expect appropriate language to be used in talking about mental health. And in fact, it's a conversation that we often have in the employment team, that it's really easy to get this wrong when you're talking about mental health. So people don't necessarily want to be referenced as a victim if you're talking about mental health. People don't necessarily want to be told that they're suffering from a mental health issue, but it can be difficult. It's probably better to talk about mental health generally and then concentrate on the appropriate language, but there is a really good website, mentalhealth.org.uk, which gives you really good pointers about the language that is a more positive mental health terminology. So why do we still find it really difficult to deal with mental health within the workplace environment? Well, it is often invisible, not always, but often invisible, partly because employees adapt quite good coping strategies to possibly hide their poor mental health. And if 38% of people don't feel that talking about mental health is going to aid their careers, then you can understand why people put coping strategies in place, and mental health conditions can be really difficult to spot. Mental health can often arise outside of work. So somebody who has poor mental health, it may not be because of anything to do with work. And employers might therefore feel, well, what can we do? Well, what they can do is to make sure that it's not going to be exacerbated by things that are happening at work. So whilst somebody may not be suffering directly from work-related stress, as is probably one of the most common GP footnote descriptions, the fact that they're suffering from personal stress doesn't mean that employers should ignore it, and it doesn't mean that the wellbeing strategies that are in place at work shouldn't be utilised. It can be really difficult to diagnose somebody who has a mental health condition. I just referenced the GP's fit notes, and we will all have seen fit notes which refer to work related stress. And quite simply, we don't really know what that is. It's probably not on its own sufficient to amount to the disability definitions that Simon was talking about. And because it's difficult to diagnose, sometimes managers might feel that they will just ride it out. They won't actually investigate further. They won't do those early interventions and seek to obtain more information. Sometimes people are actually worried about opening what they consider to be a Pandora's box on mental health problems. And that wouldn't be the case if somebody had a physical health issue. Most employers in those situations would move very quickly to getting a medical report. And we've spoken about how difficult it can be to talk about as a sensitive subject, particularly for somebody who feels quite closed and does feel that their workplace isn't creating a safe environment for them to talk about it. And it can also create really complex employee relations issues, which is perhaps one of the main reasons why the box is often not lifted and mental health issues are not looked at in the workplace in the way that they should, as early as they should. So those of you attending that have been on previous webinars will know that we sometimes put in place polls. So I would like to hear from you as to whether you've had to deal with a disciplinary or dismissal situation involving an employee with a mental health condition in the last 12 months. So an easy yes or no. If you can submit your poll results now, I'd be very grateful. Okay, all of the polls are interesting. So when you hear me say that's interesting, obviously there's got to be a reason why. But interesting because I would have expected more employers to have been dealing with a situation involving perhaps performance issues. Maybe I should have been a little bit more explicit and said performance or capability. But notwithstanding that, almost half of you have actually had a live situation in the last 12 months. So if I put the last 2 years and the last 3 years, that obviously would have been higher. The likelihood is that all of you are probably at some point in the next few years going to be dealing with mental health from an employee relations issue in respect of a matter such as capability or possibly conduct. And what I just want to spend a little bit of time on now is just talking through some of the legal issues that arise in the workplace that have an interplay with mental health. And perhaps the most obvious and perhaps the most draconian one will be if you are contemplating a dismissal situation in respect to somebody that is not performing to a satisfactory standard, and you're having to go down the performance capability route. Now, obviously, there is the ability to dismiss somebody when they're not performing, including dismissing somebody for when they're not performing due to ill health, including mental ill health. It is a fair reason for dismissal. But the two elements that are crucial to ensuring that you can then defend your decision in terms of that capability dismissal are the requirement to follow a fair process and then the requirement to act reasonably. And following a fair process in respect of any ill health capability, and particularly I think in respect of mental health problems, is to ensure that the medical evidence that you're obtaining is up to date from the appropriate expert and has been analysed properly by you and by the employee, and you've exhausted all avenues in respect of what might have been recommended in respect of that medical evidence as to adjustments that might be made, alternative roles that could be done on a temporary or on a permanent basis. And you've looked at the impact on the role, the individual, the employer, colleagues, before taking action. Now, as I said before, employers will almost always get medical evidence for physical ailments. In respect of mental ill health, there does seem to sometimes be the danger for managers to make assumptions that somebody might be able to do something because when I was feeling like that, or when I was stressed, or when I was having a bad time with all that work, I was able to do it. And it's really dangerous to go into the assumption black hole. Medical evidence is needed for mental health scenarios in the same way that it's needed in respect of physical ailments. And I just want to just remind you of the disability challenges as well. So Simon has already set out a number of cases dealing with when mental ill health may be a disability. So I don't really want to go through those again. I just want to remind of the general requirement not to directly discriminate. Doesn't happen, fortunately, very often, because most employers are pretty smart and clued up now. The requirement not to indirectly discriminate, the requirement not to treat someone less favourably for something that's arising in respect of the disability, and the special obligation with disability discrimination, which is the requirement to make reasonable adjustments, and then the generic requirement not to harass or victimise somebody on the grounds of disability. Now, just a word about knowledge. Employers and managers may say, well, how could I have been expected to have done something? I had no idea that somebody had poor mental health. Well, that might not be strictly true. Had they done what the Employment Statutory Code requires, which is to do all reasonably expected to find out if a worker has a disability, they might actually have realised that there was a mental health disability in existence. And simply saying, I was not told by the employee that they had a mental health condition or a mental health problem, is not going to be a particularly attractive defence at a tribunal when faced with a disability discrimination claim. Now, reasonable adjustments are required if somebody has a disability, but what I would also say in respect of reasonable adjustments is it's really good practice to look at this before somebody is diagnosed with a disability, before the medical evidence comes up and says there is a disability. Reasonable adjustments are probably part and parcel of your toolkit for acting fairly with employees with mental health problems. And the sorts of adjustments that you would be looking at are things such as looking at their workload. So I spoke earlier about overloading employees with too much work. That is going to create problems if somebody has poor mental health and they feel that they are inundated, overloaded, and it's just all too much in terms of the amount of work they've got. But it's also looking at the type of work they've got, not just the quantity, but the actual type of work that they have. Now, it may not always be the case that employees do want the type of work changed, but to actually review it is something that you should do and sit down and talk with employees and discuss. Are they still able to, for example, go out and have face-to-face client visits? Are they still, for example, able to be involved in face-to-face presentations internally or externally in public speaking? There may be things that have to take a bit of a backseat whilst somebody is getting well again and improving their mental health. Looking at changes in reporting lines, obviously, particularly so if there are some workplace relationship issues that are causing or are exacerbating the mental health condition. Looking at changes to working times, somebody may be more productive at certain times of the day, so certainly looking at those as adjustments. Providing people with more quiet space and more breaks, so that feeling of being overwhelmed, they can actually step back and possibly they may have some of their own coping strategies that they need time during the working day to carry out. And then looking at mentoring and counselling services that may be available for individuals through perhaps your EAP services, or you may have an internal mentoring or buddy system. And looking at your sickness absence triggers. So if you have absence management policies that require certain things to happen when somebody has been off for a certain amount of time or a certain number of occasions, then looking at reducing those so it's not a constant stress for somebody to feel that they're always going to be failing, they're always going to be triggered to the next meeting review. So I'm not saying all of those have to be put into place, but all of those are things that should be considered as part of your reasonable adjustments review. And all of those will then tie into your overall, what we call common law duty of care. So your duty to take reasonable care of employee safety. And that's not only providing them with a safe place of work and safe tools and equipment, but also a safe system of work. So a safe system of work being not overloading, making sure that there is support in place and ensuring that risks to mental health are minimised and that steps are put in place where it is foreseeable that somebody may have difficulties in doing something in the workplace. Breaching that duty of care will have the potential of leading to personal injury claims. So you might get employment tribunal claims relating to constructive dismissal, but you might also get personal injury negligence claims as well. And moving now to something that I think is often forgotten by employers, it was something that became quite popular, shall I say, about 10 years ago, when the Health and Safety Executive really majored on stress at work as one of their initiatives. But the Health and Safety Executive Management Standards is something that really should be taken into account when you're carrying out both reasonable adjustments reviews and also risk assessments of people's workplace. And the Health and Safety Management Standards look at a variety of different factors in the workplace that include demands on an individual, and that's demands in terms of their workload, patterns and environment. Looks at the amount of control somebody has in the way in which they work, so that might be the way in which they work in terms of the hours they work, where they work, the timescales in which they do their work. It also looks at support that somebody has in the workplace, so what the employer's policies are and active initiatives are on encouragement, sponsoring, mentoring and providing resource in respect of how somebody does their role. Looking at the relationship factor in work, so are employers doing what they can to promote positive working? Are they looking at initiatives to avoid conflict? So do they have anti-bullying policies? Do they have the ability to step in when they see a workplace issue that is one that's demonstrating unacceptable behaviour, and do they then take action in respect of that? Making sure that people understand their roles, making sure that people have clear job descriptions, making sure that people are given clear instructions in respect of perhaps instructions that they haven't normally carried out. And probably more important than ever over the last 2 years, looking at the impact of change on individuals and how organisational change is managed and communicated within an organisation. So bearing in mind those health and safety executive management standards is really important when you're looking at mental health in the workplace, looking at reasonable adjustments and putting in place risk assessments as well for people. And data protection issues are also incredibly key with any health data, and mental health information is no exception. So if somebody's talking to you about their mental health, that is special category data. You know, I've spoken about the fact you need to treat that confidentially. You also in law need to treat that in a certain way. And your processing of that special category data has to be in accordance with the Data Protection Act. So either the data subject has given their explicit consent. So if you're seeking a medical report, you've got explicit consent to provide information to medical experts, or that the processing is necessary to carry out employment law rights and obligations. So that might be health and safety obligations, your obligations to look at reasonable adjustments, for example, but take great care with health data. The last thing you want to do with a mental health situation is to start sharing that information with people that don't need necessarily to know about somebody's mental health. And then just finally on the legal sort of aspects, remember that if you're seeking a medical report, in respect of information from the employee's medical practitioners, then the Access to Medical Reports Act needs to be taken into account so that you have consent from the employee to seek that report. And also you notify the employee that they are entitled to see that report before you see it. And they are, in addition, entitled to request that that report is amended. Not a right to amend, but a right to request that it's amended. And if that right to, if those amendments aren't put in place by the medical practitioner, there is then an information sheet of the amends that were sought by the individual. So, and that will include requesting reports from the GP, reports from a specialist. You as the employer may well seek your own occupational health report, and again, sort of looking at the early interventions, it's probably better to seek an early occupational health report for somebody that has poor mental health, because the earlier you can ascertain what you can put in place to hopefully try and mitigate impacts, the sooner you can deal with the mental health condition and the impacts on their work. So moving now to a second poll. So how many of you have a written mental health or wellbeing policy that you have communicated to staff? Well, doesn't that just show that the CIPD's wellbeing survey was correct. That's almost spot on with the 50% that do and the 50% that don't. So obviously, the 50% or roughly 50% of employers that don't have a mental health policy need to think about seeking some internal investment in putting a policy together. Those that do have a mental health or wellbeing policy will hopefully benefit from some reminders about what should be in the policy. And also, one of what I consider to be the most important thing about a wellbeing or mental health policy is include it in the employee handbook. We review many employee handbooks, and a lot of handbooks do not include the mental health policy. It's the obvious place for somebody to look, for an employee to look for a policy. Somebody who doesn't want to talk about their mental health, doesn't want to open up, feels it might impact on their career, isn't probably going to come to HR or their manager and say, please can you post me to the mental health policy, wellbeing policy. So for goodness sake, can we start seeing more wellbeing policies in the employee handbook? But that mental health policy should be addressing your commitment to promoting positive mental health. So should include things that the Stevenson Farmer report set out, which were very much that there is good mental health and then mental health may suffer from a decline. Make it clear that this is a workplace where everybody can feel able to talk about mental health on an open basis with their managers and with HR. That there is training that is going to be available for managers and staff so that they can identify perhaps when their own mental health may be declining, but for also managers to spot their mental, to spot when their direct reports may need support. Setting out the need for support and adjustments to be put in place before formal, perhaps capability or even formal conduct processes might be initiated, and encouraging staff to open up as early as possible when they need support. But people will only do that if you identify what support is available. So really important within the policy to identify the available support. And to look very closely at what your policies on reintegrating staff who've been away perhaps for a long time can have. So gradual return to work programs for people who have been absent due to a mental health condition. And then interplaying with other policies, don't just do your mental health wellbeing policy and forget about other policies that are likely to have some degree of interplay. So we're running a little bit short on time, but those are set out there, sort of fairly obvious, the ones you need to cross-check. And then just finally looking at some initiatives and benefits that, coming back to this employee expectation, what do they expect a good employer to have as part of their mental health and wellbeing benefits? Well, they are expecting some wellness and wellbeing activities, and what those are will be, sort of up to you, but they're expecting those to be activities, not just things set out in a policy. They're expecting, when you say that you have an inclusive working culture, it is indeed a flexible and inclusive working culture. They expect their line managers to be supportive. They expect access to counselling services if they need it. They would probably expect that you have a mental health first aider or several mental health first aiders that can be the first point of triage in the event of somebody needing to talk and support. And they will expect that all of those things are made available, easily available to them. And they will also probably expect some financial wellbeing support in terms of supportive sick pay and PMI benefits. And just finishing off before I move to Stephen, supporting mental health has got to be good for business. There is a good business case. 84% of employers believe that staff who feel their mental health is supported are less likely to leave and seek other employment. simply unhappy people will leave. And, this is not the time to be impacting your talent pool. And if you really need a financial bottom line, why mental health is good for business, all of those initiatives should reduce absence levels, which should reduce overall cost. So I'm going to move on to Stephen, who's going to talk through some of the challenges that employers are now facing dealing with long COVID in the workplace. So thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Unusually, my talk is going to have very little legal content at all. It's simply going to look at long COVID, what is it, and the mental health issues that arise from it. I'm conscious of the time, and we've got a couple of questions to answer as well that have been posed by you, so I'm concerned to get on with this as soon as possible. So what is long COVID? Well, it's an informal term that's used to describe symptoms that continue or develop after a COVID infection. And it's in fact two things. The first is ongoing symptomatic COVID, which is where your symptoms continue for more than 4 weeks. And post-COVID syndrome, which is where your symptoms persist for more than 12 weeks and can't be explained by any other condition. So that if you have a pre-existing condition, long COVID isn't going to impact on that condition as far as a disability is concerned, unless I suspect long COVID makes it worse. There are many and varied symptoms of long COVID, respiratory, cardiovascular, but we're concerned today with mental health. And the type of thing that's been reported is cognitive impairment. There's a great deal of talk about this, so-called brain fog. People simply can't concentrate or remember things as they used to be able to. They suffer from headaches, sleep disturbance, delirium, apparently in older people in particular, symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety. And interestingly, and this is well borne out with the statistics that we have, the length of recovery from COVID does not appear to be related to the severity of the initial illness, which is very interesting, I think. How prevalent is COVID, long COVID? How much of a problem is this going to be for us all? According to the Office of National Statistics, in October of last year, an estimated 1.2 million people were living in private households with COVID. But the difficulty with this and most of the COVID statistics is that this is self-reported, and the figure is based on symptoms that persist for more than 4 weeks as opposed to more than 12 weeks. So we're not quite clear what the position is. And it's unclear how many of the sufferers from long COVID suffer from mental health issues. As far as I'm aware, there are no statistics that divide the two. But the charity Rethink Mental Illness suggests that 1 in 4 sufferers of long COVID suffers from a mental rather than a physical illness. I'm not sure where they base their statistics on, but plainly a large number of people in the UK are going to suffer from a mental impairment under the Equality Act, which has a long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out their day-to-day activities in the way that Simon described earlier. It's also, when considering long COVID, we should think about the ways in which people's mental health have been affected, even though they haven't suffered from COVID or long COVID themselves, and the way in which that experience differs according to who you are and where you are and how old you are. And I'll illustrate this by simply considering the experience of younger and older workers. Again, as reported, the statistics aren't very solid at the moment. But younger workers generally are at far greater risk of being furloughed and are therefore more likely to be isolated. They are unlikely to have been in jobs for long term, and their positions are likely to be much more insecure. And amongst 18 to 29-year-olds, levels of self-reported anxiety, depression, and self-harm have almost doubled during the period of the pandemic, which suggests that the isolation that young people suffer from has severely impacted on them. How does this affect older workers, those who are over 50? Well, firstly, they're at greater risk of being selected for redundancy. I mean, that's obvious to an extent because they are older, they've had longer continuity of employment in their jobs. But interestingly, on average, when they're placed on furlough, they remain on furlough for much longer and therefore are isolated for much longer. And I think it's significant that if you're older, you're much more likely to be the full-time carer of someone who's vulnerable or who has themselves had a serious COVID infection. So the mental problems caused by isolation and anxiety themselves, even if you haven't got COVID, may amount to a mental impairment under the Equality Act, but not one which is caused itself by COVID. So I'm afraid, to state the obvious, employers will have to deal with a wide range of symptoms of possible mental ill health amongst their employees, all of which will require careful management, but only some of which I think will amount to a disability. What are the warning signs? Well, according to Public Health England, typical warning signs of someone who's suffering from mental health relating to COVID, and I think this is probably general common sense anyway. They report feeling stressed, emotional outbursts, irritability, crying, socially withdrawn at work, expressing a desire to self-harm, extreme behavior, misuse of alcohol or drugs, attendance or lack of regular attendance, and the usual decline in performance that one notices in these cases. For those who are remote working, which is much more common than it was before, assessing staff is going to be much more challenging. Focus on tones of emails and online communication, and whether people are just easy to get hold of or not, or whether they appear to be withdrawn when you deal with them. Sorry, next slide, please. A few points to note in summary, drawing together the issues that Simon and Rebecca dealt with. I think that Simon mentioned the case of Jay against DLA Piper and the medicalisation of work problems or adverse life events. I think most COVID-related, long COVID-related disabilities are going to fall outside the definition of a medicalisation of a work problem or adverse life event, because the tribunal will recognise that someone has suffered from COVID, and I think are likely to accept that they have a long COVID diagnosis. I think that the indirect mental health issues related to but not caused by long COVID, such as isolation, I think they're less likely to be accepted by a tribunal so easily as being a disability. And as Simon said, remember, Rebecca said, people with mental health issues may nonetheless perform well if given the correct support. So things may not escalate into a formal process anyway. Positive things that you can do: have well-being programs in place, regular keeping in touch days, group meetings, regular face-to-face contact. I think it's important to have that physically if possible, but I think it's particularly important if you have people remote working. Keep an open mind about reasonable adjustments, again, without necessarily going through a formal process. If someone says that in order to continue to perform in the way that they are, they require an adjustment, think about an informal adjustment. As Rebecca said, I repeat once more, have a written mental health wellbeing policy that's been communicated to staff, and then everyone has a framework in which to have these discussions. And I'll just finish by saying that I think many problems we're going to have over the next year or so have one simple cause, as has been recognised by the Mental Health Awareness Week in May of this year, and that is people who have felt over the last couple of years lonely and isolated. That's the emphasis of the Mental Health Awareness Week, and I think rightly so. So my hope is that once people have got over these things, they may actually get back to a more even keel. Simon, I've had to rush through that, but I hope that that was useful.
Yeah, that was massively useful, Stephen. Very, very helpful and very interesting. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the session. There are a couple of questions that have come up. I'll try and deal with them very quickly, but we'll send out written answers. Robin Hall asks, should employers completely cede the decision of mental illness to an external medical authority? I think the answer to that is, if you're trying to work out whether somebody's disabled and you go to occupational health advisors, so often they will say, well, we don't know, and ultimately the decision is one that only a tribunal can make. So my guess is that if the reason you're going for external medical authority is to work out whether the individual's disabled, you probably won't get a really helpful answer. So I would say let's focus on the effects as the DLA Piper case suggests. But equally, Rebecca pointed out that sometimes you will need to get medical advice to forget about disability. You need medical advice to understand what the problem is and how it can best be supported. So that there can be very good reasons for taking external medical advice. Then the second question, there can be a link to mental health issues with alcohol, drugs, and gambling addictions. What would be the best approach to manage such situations? Well, I would start off with the word support. Obviously, somebody suffering from or experiencing those issues needs support. The second thing or question in my mind is, are they disabled? If you're addicted to a substance, then that doesn't amount to an impairment, so it won't amount to a disability. But sometimes the impact of that addiction, for example, physical problems to do with the liver, they would amount to an impairment, and therefore the individual is disabled. Somebody who suffers from an addiction to gambling, probably not disabled unless it has an impact on their ability to carry out day-to-day activities. The first word that springs to mind there is support. Okay, well, we're slightly overrunning, so thank you for bearing with us. As I say, we'll prepare an answer to your questions, and similarly, we'll post a recording of this webinar to our website. So I look forward to seeing you next time, and thank you very much for attending. Bye now.